The big one.
Sitting there.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at Malleable Robinson Booksellers. On behalf of the store, and with thanks to ARP Books, I'd like to thank you all for joining us here this evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Malleable Robinson Booksellers is located on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, Malleable Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here today to celebrate the launch of Meeka Walsh's selected essay collection, Malleable Forms, published by ARP Books. I'll have a few introductions for tonight's participants in just a moment, just a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. While we are enclosed within this gray space, we just ask that all in the audience please put on their masks and continue to wear them throughout the course of the event. You'll notice those folks who are behind microphones will remove them temporarily while speaking. And once we exit this location for the signing itself, at that point, masks will become strongly recommended, but not obligatory. So thank you so much. And we very much appreciate your indulgence and cooperation. In addition to that, following tonight's reading and conversation, there'll be an opportunity for you all to ask questions. Now, during the Q&A, simply because passing the microphone around to everybody in a room seems perhaps like an unwise idea, I'm going to ask you to ask me the question, which I will then repeat into the microphone for the benefit of all those watching at home. Now, please know I will not nearly be able to do proper justice to your eloquence in putting extended questions to Meeka. So we would ask that you keep them relatively succinct. Rest assured you will have ample time to interrogate her when you actually visit the signing table immediately thereafter, and offer any positive comments at that time as well. At the close of the event, we will ask you to remain seated for one moment while we do transport Meeka, at which point I will have some more adrenaline-packed signing instructions for you all. So thank you so very much. All those watching on YouTube now, you will also be able to participate in the Q&A. So over the course of the evening, please do feel free to write any questions you might have in the chat box, and we'll be sure to put them to Meeka as time permits. But that is absolutely more than enough for me. I'd now like to introduce our guest of honor for this evening and your host for tonight. Meeka Walsh is a writer and critic who has been the editor of Border Crossings magazine since 1993. She has contributed catalog essays and articles on a wide range of Canadian and American artists. Her short fiction has been published in a number of anthologies, among them the Oxford Book of Stories by Canadian Women in English. She has received the RCA Gold Medal for her contribution to the arts, and in 2017, she was made a member of the Order of Canada. She lives in Winnipeg. Your host tonight is Robert Enright, who also lives in Winnipeg. He is the research professor in art theory and criticism in the graduate program of the School of Fine Art and Music at the University of Guelph. Robert is also the senior contributing editor to Border Crossings magazine. He is recognized as one of the country's most perceptive and wide-ranging art critics, and has contributed introductions, essays, and interviews to 300 books and catalogs in Canada, the US, England, and Europe. For 25 years, he was an art critic for CBC Network radio shows and was the cultural reporter, film critic, and host of Heartland for CBC Television here in Winnipeg. In 2005, he was made a member of the Order of Canada and was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Winnipeg in 2016. We'll be hearing from him later, but please, for now, join me in welcoming Meeka Walsh.
Just getting here is a hazard. Well, I have some thank yous I'd like to say, or give. Thank you to Malleable Robinson for hosting this event, and to John for making me feel so welcome. Thank you for being here. It's so nice to gather together in person. You can almost, so some of us actually did touch. I want to thank the press, ARP. They gave me free rein and full support. I really have to thank them enormously. I'm delighted to be on their list. They publish significant books. So thank you to Todd Besant, to Brett Parenteau, and most especially to Irene Bindi, who took the book through production with me. It was a terrific pleasure to work with her. And thank you to the press for having Pat Sanders copy edit the book. I've worked and continue to work with Pat, and I trust her absolutely. Thank you. I want to thank Barry Schwabsky too for the essay, the introductory essay that he contributed to the book. EM Forster's Only Connect says it in the best way possible. It's a wonderful thing to have your work received so well and to feel that you have connected with somebody. And well, thank you to Robert, my companion in everything, really. So what I'm going to do is read a few short pieces from a few of the essays, and I'll try and introduce them. So I'm going to begin with Georges Perec. He was a French writer. He died in the 80s. You might know Life, a User's Manual. He was a writer, a filmmaker, an essayist, but the book that might be best known to everyone is Life, a User's Manual. And the essay that I'm reading from is called Soft Chalk and Pigeons. And I picked it because George, well, his father was killed in the early years of the Second World War, and his mother, fearful for his safety, sent him to live with family in Switzerland. He was maybe 2 or 3. She died in the Holocaust. So he grew up without immediate family memories. And what he did was set about to construct a memory for himself. And this he did with language, with writing. Georges Perec had a sense of what constituted life, reality. It wasn't what was remarkable, extraordinary, or eventful. It was what happened daily and passed without comment. The regular and banal, habitual and quotidian, and therefore necessary in its tedious laying down of substructure, the strata of building, the substance that escaped notice, the element and condition he called the infraordinary. He would show what this was through writing, and in spite of the lightness of his hand and lack of stylistic embellishments that give his writing its fine, transparent quality, in spite of the list of the plain daily activities and materials he enumerates, what he fills space with ends up being beautiful. In Species of Spaces, he says, quote, "There are few events which don't leave a written trace, at least. At one time or another, almost everything passes through a sheet of paper," close quote. And the examples build. The margins of a newspaper, the back of a ticket, a check, a kitchen list, a receipt, and so on. This is how space begins, he says, with words only, signs traced on the blank page. To describe space, to name it, trace it. Space as inventory, space as invention. He populates a town with words of invention. He animates a train pulling cars filled with goods. It passes lit windows, someone waves. All of it, words on paper. An idealized space, space as reassurance. Because the words bring the space into being, and he holds sway over the words, and he has ordered and manufactured space. Space is reassurance against the oblivion of memory's void. The small daily details, the ordinary matter, are what make the world reliable, concrete, and clear, he tells us. He brings it closer still in Species of Spaces in our, quote, perceiving that the earth is a form of writing, a geography of which we had forgotten that we ourselves are the authors. That was that first essay. And the second one is something called A Moral Place in the World. And this one was written a couple of years ago, and out of my concern for our state of being morally adrift. Incredulous, exhausted by disbelief, I, among others, find myself speechless in this time when the necessity for speech is urgent. Donald Trump and his cabinet of mean-minded compatriots in the White House. What is there to say about a situation willed by millions of American voters? Alarming that there was a consensus sufficiently broad to bring this dangerous, limited, vulgar man and his ilk to power. It's a situation of statehood about which others have said this, quote, "The unbridled, naked materialism and cynicism and appetite for cruelty and violence in the United States is very disturbing. It's the acceptance of vulgar and anti-idealistic values. I'm not trying to idealize the past or say that it's so much better elsewhere, but I think that when you get a society which doesn't even have any decent hypocrisies anymore, in which people are so shameless in their rituals, the way, oops, lost a page. The way in which people are so shameless in their meanness and their selfishness and their avidity, and the willingness to judge almost everything by criteria of material gain, then you are certainly on the way toward a society in decline. A society can't operate, I think, so cynically and continue to prosper. It can't teach its citizens to be so selfish and call that individualism," close quote. And here's another quote, "Contemporary man is being afflicted with contradictions and perplexities, living in anguish in an affluent society. His anxiety makes a mockery of his boasts. Passing through several revolutions simultaneously, his thinking is behind the times. High standards of living, vulgar standards of thinking, too feeble to stop the process of the spiritual liquidation of man," close quote. These two sections are not from last week's edition of the New Yorker, not from the New York Times or Harper's Magazine or the Washington Post, all publications full of justified and cautionary alarms at the state of the country in which they are publishing their worried and informed critiques. The first is from an interview Border Crossings published in 1988 with the American writer Susan Sontag. Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States and was near to completing his second term in office. The second quotation is by Polish-born scholar, writer, and theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel, who escaped to America in 1940, where he lived until his death in 1972. The essay from which this was taken, titled "What We Might Do Together," was first published in the journal Religious Education in 1967. Deeply concerned and engaged in the social and political environments in which they lived, each wrote from their individual present, speaking to the future we now inhabit. 20 years separate these pieces, one from the other. Neither writer is alive today. Would they be bereft and despairing to know that their worry and caution had apparently been futile? 50 years since Heschel wrote his words, 29 since Susan Sontag delivered hers. I think the present is an age of acute loneliness. We are lonely because we are selfish, self-serving, seeking to satisfy our personal needs first. Or we are selfish and looking to satisfy our own needs because we are alone, lonely, and have only ourselves. The haunting plaint of the opening line of Rilke's Duino Elegies states, "Better than any other could, this condition of being alone. What angel, if I called out, would hear me?" The answer, inherent or implied, contained in the sobbed question is, no one. So that's a little dreary, a little grim, but alas, it's still applicable. This is an essay called, a section from an essay called "What's Up, Doc?" I'm addressing here the issue of art writing. And what is art writing? How do we write about art? What do we make in writing that might be comparable or equivalent to the art that's being addressed? And Hickey labored with those issues all the way through, in spite of his, what I think is brilliant writing. His important to me at the time, air guitar, the book and essay. So this is in response really to that issue, but I'm going to start here. I want to talk about my experience with rabbits, or more likely hares. They come to mind because here the summer is short, the day is green and long with light, so what is around is remarked. And what I see when I visit my mother in the suburban house where I grew up, with its nice green lawn and neat full garden, are hares. Bold as cats, they are confident, slow, and numerous. I write them as hares because they distinguish themselves from rabbits by being furry at birth, whereas rabbits are born naked, and by their long, powerful hind legs. By this description, Elmer Fudd's wascally rabbit was himself a hare, and for me, as a child, a cartoon Lothario. I was hooked on that rabbit. And what comes to mind too was an early crush on a boy a few years older than I was, and therefore entirely unavailable. He 11 or 12 to my 8 or 9. But what I can't bring clear is who came first. Did I fancy him because he was tall for 11 and had those particular kind of cheeks and a ready smile with maybe slightly rabbity teeth? Or did I cotton to Bugs Bunny because he had long legs, prominent cheeks, and always visible genitalia? Who knows? But both had, for me, interchangeable as they apparently were, what I later came to recognize as sex appeal. In art, there have been some pretty formidable hares. You can't think rabbits without thinking about Mary Flanagan, or Joseph Beuys, or Albert Dürer. Now, Dürer's drawing Young Hare, 1502, is a rodent of another kind. This one, set diagonally on the sheet, faces the viewer, and with pointed black claws on his neatly aligned forelegs and one evident on the tucked under hind leg, is no bunny. Not that the fur hasn't been rendered tactile and inviting, not that the rich long ears aren't velvety and thickly dressed, not that the whiskers and brow hairs aren't sooty and well elaborated. It's that his haunches are flexed, his claws are honed, and his eyes are on us. We are confronted by the consummate skill of the drawing. But we are not for a minute mistaken by art, not by Beuys, not by Dürer. Neither, I expect, did the artists intend mimetic deceit. And I wonder, thinking again of Dave Hickey, how does drawing an object or subject escape his lament for writing's inability to do the same? Throughout his essay, Air Guitar, Hickey has conducted a conversation with himself, recalling his early misguided intentions, warning against the diluting, diminishing hegemony of institutional writing, about art, about writing generally, and has come to the end of the discussion to tell us that the discourse surrounding cultural objects is at once freely contingent and counter-entropic. And what's more, and thank heavens I say, that he will continue to add to it. I agree with his conclusion, but I hadn't shared his initial despair. Yes, the object shrugs off critical language and remains discreetly, profoundly intact. Fine. But something well written is a made thing, and never the object's replacement any more than Dürer's seductively dangerous hair ever left the paper on which it was drawn and ate all the lettuces in the garden. This essay was called Dangerous Persuasions, and it was prompted by a book of Carolee Schneeman's writing. I don't know if many here would know who Carolee Schneeman is. She was a critical, groundbreaking feminist artist. She was a mentor, guide. She was stunning. And she has a Winnipeg connection. She came here often to give lectures, to do workshops, and her amazing video archive is housed here in Video Pool. So there is a Winnipeg connection. She wrote a book, a large book of letters, substantial letters, and they date from 1956 to 1999, and there are more not included in this one volume. Together, what is published is a document of a time, the second half of the 20th century to the millennium, which saw enormous changes in technology and radical changes in politics as borders shifted and regimes fell and rose. Women, too, began to look for change. The feminist movement rose and gained ground and strength, and some things did shift for women. The letters Carolee Schneeman wrote mark the process and outcomes of a period and its key players in astute and vivid detail. She is a fine letter writer, intelligent, highly intuitive, and also critically perceptive. The historical period is well documented here, but perhaps more significant is the epistolary drawing of this remarkable artist's biography. A personal letter is subjective, of course. There's no need to be equitable or even-handed, no necessity to be social. It's the ideal place for personal indulgence, candor, peevishness, even small tantrums. It's also a rare and generous occasion with its containment and potential for elaboration, with a writer in an almost dreamlike state to fill the burgeoning space of one page slipped behind the next with associative imagery, plans, and wishes, nascent enactments of heart and mind. Fold, lick, and send off, stamped with postage, and trusting the receiver. Schneemann's letters were written for one reader, but her intentions were much broader. She made and kept copies and saved the letters she received, and as a result, they moved from the private to the public, with history as intervener. She was writing her own piece, writing herself into the self she constructed and became, and writing this self into history. Prescient, and for all the good reasons that the period, the patriarchy, misogyny, entrenched power structures, fear, and rising conservatism presented. With her work, she changed history. With her record, she secured it. Fully aware, she wrote in the present for the future. That fatigue never set in, or more likely it did. That despair wasn't overwhelming, which the letters indicate was also the case. That insult and rage alternated as responses to the hegemony of pervasive institutionalized power is recorded in many of the letters. And joy, pleasure, excitement about projects, hers and others, and love and passion, which were overriding sentiments driving most of the correspondence, all attest to Schneemann's enormous strength and tensile resiliency. And finally, an essay called Nostalgia for the Present, Max Blecker. And this one is from, excuse me, a section that I have titled The Ineffable. The ineffable is a state I find seductive, necessary, and unattainable. Nostalgia for the present. Why not attach oneself to the fullness of an object in order to decipher and grasp meaning? There's an irrefutable certainty in an object's right plumb roundness, and more, it is both integral and indisputable object self, and a myriad other things. For an extraordinarily gifted man who died at 29 and was bedridden for the last 10 years of his life, the body offered no assurance at all, and being thoughtful, he would have looked to something out of which to construct and make meaning. Objects, but here serving double purpose as both trigger or stimulus and impediment. A man in the rain carrying a chandelier on his back, whose crystal prisms glistened and tinkled as he went on his way, would provoke the viewer to wonder, what constitutes the gravity of the world? The questioning ill young man is the unnamed protagonist in Max Blecker's book, Adventures in Immediate Irreality, first published in Romania in 1936, and then reissued by New Directions in 2015. It's not a novel. Its plot is an interior disquisition and series of notes, sensual observations and sensations, interior, like Joyce's Ulysses, but brief. Its duration is not diurnal, but is the time of one summer. It is meditative or induces reverie. Its motion or gestures are not linear or additive, leading finally to a resolution. It is immersive, like a warm bath, amniotic in its apprehension, the protagonist often seeming to come to himself in the street, as though waking from a dream and surprised, but only mildly to find himself where he is. The book doesn't declare itself an autobiography. The writing isn't that of the memoirist. There's no reflective distance, and memories, when they present themselves, are absorbed in the stirred mix that urges the search for an identity. Undeclared as such, we can't say this is an autobiography, but it's impossible not to equate the writer and the protagonist, their search seeming the same given the circumstances of both. I join the protagonist and the author in finding myself immersed sometimes in a state of being, not a dream, but another state of consciousness. There's a medical term for a kind of anesthetic, waking sedation, it's called, carrying with it a glamour and literary inventiveness not usually attributed to medicine. but equally as ambivalent as most medical responses are. You are awake and asleep. You are awake and remember nothing. Even immediate and acute pain. You are in the present and elsewhere. How do they do that? For Blecker, it was both the tense in which he wrote and the condition of his being. The source or cause of his displacement was dire, of course. But even in safe circumstances and good health, consciousness is mutable and expansive, and awareness and engagement shift and alter. Gaston Bachelard writes at length, thoroughly and with tenderness, about the refuge, safety, and significance of the nest. I look tenderly at my family, who always find nests. They don't touch them, but they find them. I've always coveted one from the time of being small and close to the ground to the present, where walking with my dogs leads me to the underspace of shrubs, the slender trunks of reedy trees in an informal garden, a small copse grown up randomly and left as such. Dog walking is primarily a city activity and is sidewalk bound, but not so much as to preclude the edges. And I find myself, for example, sidling up to the Christmas light bulbs, decorating a low branch of a pine tree, removing my glove to gauge the heat being generated, wondering if it would be sufficient to warm a nest under the boughs, such that I and my two large dogs could create a night shelter in the brown leaves with the small rustling rodents whose dry breath and bodies also contribute to the warmth we would yield together in that leafy, shallow bowl of a nest into which, in improbable harmony, we all would fit and sleep undisturbed and well. The ineffable.
Thank you.
Hello. This is a strange position for me to be in because Meeka and I have worked together now for a long period of time. And while I've interviewed a lot of writers and artists, and we talk about language all the time in our various capacities at Border Crossing. She is also my editor. We've never actually talked about her writing in an official capacity like this. So it's a particular pleasure to do this tonight because I'll probably find out things I don't know she thinks about writing, and that will come as a surprise, maybe to her and me, but I should have asked before. Well, here I go, she is an editor, being admonished for not having done my research. But you know, the notion of pleasure is interesting because you mentioned Barry Schwabsky's introduction, and he takes a particular pleasure in something you do in your writing, and that's this idea of connectedness. But what interests him is the surprise of the things you bring together, Kim Gordon and Robert Motherwell. Frank O'Hara within a strange sort of place. What is it about the combinations that you do with artists and writers that make them work for you, and where do they come from? Because I think they surprise all readers of your essays.
Where do they come from? Well, they often come from the shelves in my library. They come from my sense of...
They just spank it just like that.
Should I slap him with the glove? Where do my connections come from? I don't know. I guess, you know, I live, I think we probably all live in some degree or another metaphorically. This like this is as if this. And so I put together things that may not be obvious, but seem to me to be at least contiguous or responsive one to the other. And that is where connections come from. We do find and try to make connections even with strange things or things which are estranged, or to which we are estranged.
You know, that the essay itself as a form is interesting because it's sort of to essay is to attempt and to move forward. It implies a kind of journey. And I'm poaching an idea from a writer you write about in the book, and that's Paul Clay, who says the drawing is taking a line for a walk. In a way, sort of take ideas for a walk too. Does that language as journey metaphor make any sense to you?
Well, it does, because when I write, whether it's fiction or essays, nonfiction, literary nonfiction, however you identify an essay, I have a point of departure, but I'm always surprised by where the writing, it seems fatuous, but anyone who's written, and I mean, the same thing may apply to all art forms, but you're surprised where the creative route leads you. You're surprised by the connections, by what's inside your head that you've now given license to present itself.
That's interesting. So that for you, in a way, the essay isn't that you're telling the reader something, you're discovering what it is you know in the process of doing the writing, that the process is what is generating, making the language connect.
Well, it's certainly a tool, it's an implement. I mean, I don't start something without an idea. It's especially when I'm writing an essay, it's grounded in a position. It's there is a point of view. It's what Susan Sontag calls passionate partiality. In other words, it's subjective, but there has to be a passion that impels it, and a point of view, the subjective voice. I'm not interested in one writing. I'm interested in someone declaring themselves.
In the essay on Clarice Lispector, the Brazilian writer, you mentioned Ellen Sixu, the feminist critic. And you had this lovely phrase that you say she entered the language, the country of language. That's a country that you seem fairly comfortable in. I guess this is asking you to make an observation about is it ease with language, Meeka, that you have in the writing?
Well, I don't know how far we want to go back and how confessional we want to be. I am an only child, and so I spent a lot of time alone. And I told myself stories to entertain myself, to set loneliness at bay, and to make sense of the world. If no one is there to answer questions, you make your own stories.
Do you think there's what you would call a Walsh style in the book?
Well,
it wasn't meant to be a trick question. I mean,
well, I never thought of myself as Walsh. For starters, that was what stopped me for starters. So I have to think about. I hope I have an identifiable style, but it would be for someone else to identify. I'm inside it. If it's there, couldn't identify it.
Well, let me quote one of the people who does a wonderful comment about your book, and that's Guy Madden, the Winnipeg filmmaker.
He's in Edmonton, or he would be.
Yeah, he says, I'm quoting him directly on this, that what you do is you stake out a position as one of today's most omnivorous and original lyric essayists. So here's a clue about what might be the Meeka style, is the notion of the lyric. I mean, how important is that tone in your writing, you think?
Well, I write for the ear, and that's part of the storytelling. I tell myself stories. It has to sit inside the ear. It has to fit and be melodious. It has to be rhythmic.
Mm-hmm.
Chum, chum.
So does that mean that you find that
that's an inside joke.
It's an inside joke, because I'm not going to tell you a joke, and then you know what the chum is about, but that's a whole different thing. But that notion of lyric is interesting, because your language, I guess it's a question of the nature of your observation. You seem to me to be an extremely careful observer. So this goes back to the notion of where the language comes from. Is it that you look closely at things and then you find the language which appropriately describes the thing that you've looked closely at, whether it's in the world or a person or an object?
I think there's no gap. I think that perception is seamless. I see it and think about it and identify it all at one time.
So when Yeats says, how can you tell the dancer from the dance? There is no separation for you in the way that you write.
No.
Yeah, yeah. You have a special understanding, comes up over and over again in the book throughout the essays, of both nature and the animal world. Does that also go back to your being an only child, or where do you think that sense of observation comes from in the writing, which is made so manifest over and over again in the book?
Well, I had the great good fortune of spending all my summers from the time I was in gestation in Gimli and out of doors. And my mother and my grandmother grew up on a farm and had an intuitive link and identification with nature. And so we spent a lot of time outside. We picked berries, and my grandmother taught me how to cite which were useful and productive places where you would find wild strawberries, and which areas in which grasses indicated it was too wet. And you wouldn't find strawberries, but you might find black currants. So yes, I was close to nature, and it's also very much nicer than people. I'm sorry to say this.
How about
Animals
are way nicer.
are nature. Yes, animals never let you down, ever.
You know, Chris Krause, who also does comments in the back of the book, calls you an ideal reader of things, and she draws attention to something that becomes apparent when you pay close attention to the work, is that a lot of your writing is about writing. Is that a kind of inevitable consequence of your reading, or is it that in language you find ways that language then is generated?
Well, I mean, books have been a source for me forever, and we live in Winnipeg after all. So you have to be inventive, and you have to gather material where you can find it, and we are isolated here. So books have been a source for me forever. That's where I go first for ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else's ideas. I want to connect. I want to strike off someone else, and someone else's thinking and their experiences and their wisdom and knowledge and all of that.
In the book too, you've written about a number of people. I'm thinking of Robert Motherwell, Carolee Schneemann, Nancy Spiro, who you knew. Is it, when you're writing about people who you know who are artists, is it different than when you write about writers or artists that you don't know, but who you discover through books and pictures?
Well, the knowledge is different. It's not personal, but I don't think the approach is necessarily different. If I'm writing about the work, I try to be as objective as I can while writing subjectively.
Yeah, thank you. Descartes wrote just was about to roll over in his grave for a moment. Fortunately, you saved him the turn. You know, you want to talk about your method? Like you chose 47 essays from a much larger selection for this book as well. What was it that determined the ones you chose, and then the way that you organized them in a kind of thematic clusters, notions of home, as you said, the ineffable, about writing. So there are various subjects inside the book as well. But what made you choose certain essays, and then why did they get formed the way they did in the book?
What do you mean methodology in relation to this book, or in terms of the way I write?
Well, you can start with the latter, about the way you write, and then talk about how you organized your writing.
It probably won't surprise anyone to learn that I write longhand. I don't use a quill, but I do write with a pen and paper. So I write that way. I guess everything cooks and stews in advance because I rarely do second drafts. In other words, my first draft is usually pretty close to the finish. And I write in terms of whenever I can find time. Alas, late at night, stolen time at weekends. That's the methodology.
And so
the practicality, maybe.
Right. So the choice of the 47 essays. So that I mean, there were many more to choose from.
Yeah, there were probably about 150. Well, I wanted. The pieces in this book are pretty close to the bone, so I wanted them to be pieces that I felt a particular affection for. I also wanted there to be a bit of a representation of the kind of subjects I've addressed. How else did I choose them? I think that was it. As I read through the ones that I picked, I recognized certain topics came up, and they're loosely categorized. I mean, Barry Schwabsky said they're all in effect about the central topic of or subject of ineffability.
That's interesting because, of course, the ineffable really means inexpressible. So here you are writing about a thing that can't be written about in illustrated. Is that paradox one that you're aware of when you're doing the writing?
Yeah, I like to play with that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to bring the subject back so that it's still sensible and grounded, but it's not fatuous, especially when it's about people or work that I'm writing about.
Mm-hmm. This is a pretty goofy last question in lots of ways, but is there an essay or essays or sections that in the book that, I mean, in a way, this book is now in the world, and so it's sort of almost not yours as well. So can you look at it with some sense of the dispassion and think, oh, I particularly like that essay, that's one that really resonates for me?
I can't pick a favorite.
There you go. That's always good. We are going to open it up now to questions from the audience. And as John pointed out, you can't touch the microphone or him, as far as that goes, although he didn't say that. If there are any questions, and don't be shy, where Meeka will be more than happy to entertain them, or not.
And I should also point out that if you do happen to be watching on YouTube, just write your question in the live chat and we'll get to it. While you were going through all these essays, and they are a number of essays from many years, did you find the desire to rewrite any of them, or are they reprinted in their original form?
But for the occasional typo, they're largely as they were.
I'm astonished that you could resist the urge. Obviously, you do a much better job than most people.
Or maybe I only have one idea and there's nothing to add.
It is when Meeka says that they're longhand writing. I mean, I've seen those written scripts, and it's just an incredible focus. And there aren't a lot of changes that happen after the initial writing. I don't know anybody else who writes like that, to tell you the truth. It seems,
it's scary.
yeah, I know, it's pretty unusual. There's a question, John, in the corner.
In revisiting all the essays to prepare for the book, did you find that your writing had changed over time?
Actually, not really. Not really. I guess I picked in the initial selection, maybe I picked the pieces that I felt were more practiced. I mean, I would hope that I get better over time. There has to be a possibility for learning and improvement. But there were discernible changes. I don't think.
Other questions?
While we are waiting for questions, there is an expression of affection from one of your children. So love from Tip, Zach, Elvira, and Hazel.
Oh, that's nice. That's the Kelowna, BC branch of the family. Oh, very nice.
Meeka, thank you so much. I'd like to, I don't know, I fantasize talking to you as an artist, and I see you as an artist. But how much of the essay right can be considered an art, or if you see that as an art form or as criticism? Because all the time when I read you, my own personal stream of consciousness gets out all the time, because you make me travel all the time, right? So I wonder if you practice your writing more like a artist or critic, right? And how you relate to those things. And maybe just to try to be a little bit more clear on that, is your stream of consciousness during a writing happens immediately, or is that also informed by research, by afterthoughts, by things that come in afterwards, by looking at references? How that happens?
Well, I do research where I can and where it's applicable. I don't, when I prepare in advance, and then I don't interrupt the writing. So I do research, I do my thoughts, I make some notes, not lots, but some notes, and then I write. So it's almost uninterrupted. So maybe stream of consciousness is an applicable term. And I do think, you know, in the way that I suggested with Dave Hickey, that writing is also a made thing in the way that art is. And so I don't, if the work is well done, it's artful, it's art. So I don't separate good criticism from fiction that I admire, except for the basis in fact, but not in form.
Just one last thing that came to me just right now.
Oh, as much, Ricardo, it's so nice to talk with you.
I think there was a time where painting became about painting. Right? Painting was not anymore about anything else, but it was painting. And I think your writing is pretty much like that. It's writing itself. It's not necessarily about anything else, it's in itself. It's the experience.
Thank you. Was there a question there?
No, it was just my own stream of thought that came from your reading it, from the conversation that I missed.
Thank you.
John, how are we doing for time, by the way?
We're around 5 minutes.
Okay, any more questions? I don't want to stop people from asking questions, but I think the reason why John wanted to get near you is because the people on screen where it's being live streamed can't hear unless the question's asked. So that's the only reason why. No, it's all right. As usual, you screwed things up, but don't worry, don't worry, my dear friend. Other questions?
Just looking back, are there some things that seem less ineffable now than at the beginning of thinking about the essays and stuff?
Looking back, are there some things that seem less ineffable now than they were at the beginning of this collection?
Well, the possibility of bringing this book out, and again, I owe a debt of thanks to ARP and to Irene Bindi. Yeah, it was, it felt, the magazine is consuming, so I have very little time. And I wanted to do this for a long time. And once I approached the press, and the manuscript was, well, it didn't go through the usual process, I guess. It was just assumed that, because the content was known, that it was going to be published. So what was the ineffability of bringing out another book, because the last book I brought out was such a long time ago, it was a book of short stories. As I said, the magazine has consumed me. Then the ineffable became real with the publication of this book, and how beautiful it is, how exactly what I wanted it is.
It's interesting, Meeka, you mentioned the notion of short story writing that you were doing earlier, but there are lots of essays and sections in the book, even particularly maybe in the home section, in which the writing, and maybe that's what Guy was getting at in the notion of the lyric aspect of the essays, that the essay tends to be a kind of form that is taking a position and then elaborating it. But there are moments throughout this book where I marvel at the kind of beauty of the language. It seems to be, and it's not that it's fictional, it's that somehow the language takes on a different register or something? I mean, are you aware in the writing when the writing gets, and I don't mean more personal, that would be to categorize it too simply, when the writing gets different, it gets closer to what you would consider fiction than criticism?
Do I know when that happens?
Yeah.
Oh, yes,
Do you orchestrate that?
yes. It's like a jazz riff. Yeah, I pull it back because if it's an essay about a topic, then the topic isn't necessarily my meanderings.
Yeah, well, I mean, for instance, the rabbit section, which people clearly loved, is an example of a kind of riff that got to be, I mean, it plays inside the context of art writing, because you mentioned all those rabbits in art, but it's also the way in which it goes back into your life. And so that register is a really interesting one to combine. And you were very aware of that happening. But here I'm asking a writer who knows what she's doing, whether she knows what she's doing. And the answer is to look at me as if I'm an idiot. So I'm not going to ask any more questions like that. Any other question from somebody who's way smarter than I am about questions?
We do have a two-pronged question that's come in online. It is from Luther, who expresses congratulations on the publication. Luther was hoping, first of all, Meeka, that you could talk about the title you chose and how you came to it.
The title for the collection?
Exactly.
I think that the essay can be just about anything, and I like to think that my writing can be anything, and that's further to what Robert just spoke about. So the form is malleable, the form of the essay and the form that my writing takes. I don't adhere to what Dave Hickey referred to as institutionalized writing. I don't want to write forgive me, in a constrained academic manner. I'm looking right at three stunning academic writers, but right here. But I'm not obliged I'm not peer reviewed. So.
By the way, every one of those academic writers has been published in Border.
In Border Classics, that's right, that's why they're here.
What's the second problem?
Sorry. The second part of the question actually puts you on the spot, Robert. Luther was hoping to know what you think of how Meeka's writing has evolved for as long as you've known her, and whether you think this publication is a reflection of that evolution.
Well, I think it's an extraordinary book. And has the writing evolved? It infuriates me that when she says that it doesn't seem to have changed much. She's probably right. You're right. She's been a remarkable writer for a long period of time, and this book is. The range of the essays covers a fair amount of time, but you never know that. I would defy anybody, a close reader, to pick which of the essays are earlier than other ones. There's a kind of maturity in the writing which is amazing. I mean, she's one of the most important people in my life, but this is a book that I can look at with genuine admiration and envy. So yeah, it hasn't changed, unfortunately. Yes. Double pronged. Any other questions? Do you have any questions of yourself?
I question myself all the time. This isn't the place for it.
Anyway, thank you all for coming, and please join me in congratulating. That's amazing.
Thank you so much, Robert and Meeka. We are now going to move along to the signing portion of the evening, so we will ask you all just to remain in your place for one moment while we move Meeka to a table, which is located just beside our cash desk. Please do feel free to go up and have a copy of the book signed. We have copies at our central cash desk. We have copies on the table itself. All we ask is that you do please remember to pay for the book at some point before you hit the parking lot. We're so grateful for your attention this evening. We're so grateful to all of you watching on YouTube. This video will remain live if you'd like to revisit it or share it with anyone who was unable to come. We're just so very grateful to see you all. One quick note is that the store is closed for most customers. However, those of you here for the book signing, rest assured you will be able to get your book signed and will not be locked out. So please do avail yourself of our cash desk when you wander up. And I'd just like to ask all of you to join me one final time in acknowledging ARP Books, Robert Enright, and of course, Meeka Walsh. Thank you all so very much.